Well, good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm Joshua Thompson, and I am the Director of Equality and Opportunity Litigation at Pacific Legal Foundation. We are excited to be co-hosting this event today with Defend American Ideals and the Pacific Research Institute. For those of you not familiar with our organizations, I can give a brief overview. Defend American Ideals is a nonprofit that uses public advocacy and education to advance the founding ideals, that we are all created equal and should be judged by the content of our character. The Pacific Research Institute is a California-based think tank which advocates for freedom, opportunity, and personal responsibility for all individuals by advancing free market policy solutions. And Pacific Legal Foundation is a national nonprofit legal organization that defends Americans' liberties when threatened by government overreach and abuse. We use litigation to defend constitutional rights and set precedents that protect everyone. Today's event will cover the most pertinent issues related to reparations. We'll discuss the California Reparations Task Force's policy proposals in California, as well as similar proposals in other states. We'll address the moral, social, and historical aspects of reparations and the consequences of these proposals in context. Before beginning, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping matters. This event will be recorded and circulated to all registered attendees. If you have a question at all during the webinar, please go ahead and drop it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll answer audience questions later in the event. And with that, I'd like to introduce some of our panelists to you all today. Betty Chu is the Vice Chair of Defend American Ideals. She's an attorney, a banker, and the former mayor of Monterey Park, California. She is the first American woman of Chinese descent to co-found and run a bank, and the first female Chinese lawyer in Southern California. Andrew Quinio is an attorney at Pacific Legal Foundation, where he works in the equality and opportunity practice. He is a member of the bar in the state of California and has previously litigated at the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs Office of General Counsel. And Ying Ma, who will be moderating the first section of this event, is the president of Defend American Ideals. She also serves as president of the American Ideals PAC, has extensive political campaign experience, and is the author of Chinese Girl in the Ghetto. And with those introductions, Ying, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Josh. Defend American Ideals is very pleased to co-sponsor this important discussion. More details about us are available on our website at defendamericanideals.com. We are honored to have Robert Woodson as our keynote speaker today. Bob and I will engage in a conversation for about 15 minutes before the next panel featuring Betty and Andrew. Bob is the founder and president of the Woodson Center, 1776 Unites, and Voices of Black Mothers United. He is an influential leader on the issues of poverty alleviation and empowering disadvantaged communities to become agents of their own uplift. He is also a sought-after social commentator, and I'm sure many of you have seen him on TV. He has appeared on Fox News, NBC, CNN, C-SPAN, and other networks. Bob, welcome. Great to see you.
Pleased to be here.
Well, few policymakers were discussing reparations seriously until a few years ago. Today, we've seen reparations proposals proliferating around the country. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think because of the attention given to the murders of killing of Freddie Gray in Baltimore a decade ago, followed by Michael Brown, George Floyd, all of this, these police encounters like this has really energized what I call the race grievance industry. And it's always been at the expense of low-income people. For instance, what's happening is like in Cincinnati, when the young man was killed by a police officer, Sharpton and the other came in, organized a boycott of Cincinnati. And as a consequence, you have your first incidence of police nullification. The police said, well, if we're going to be charged for trying to be aggressive in high crime, and we will then not police as aggressively. As a consequence, during the course of the next 6 months, the murder rate in high crime Black areas went up 800%. But none of the civil rights leaders or pastors that were advocating the sanctions against the police or the boycott of the city had to suffer the consequence of their advocacy. And that pattern continues with Michael Brown in Ferguson. Of the 51 people arrested for rioting and looting in Ferguson, only one was from Ferguson. And as a consequence, when I went there, you saw people were cut off from the city because they had to depend on public transport. In other words, low-income Blacks have suffered the consequence of us racializing the issue. And so the reparations is just one expression of what this unfortunate emphasis that has the consequence of hurting the very people they say they're trying to help.
Okay, well, so Congressman Barbara Lee, the highest ranking Black woman appointed to the Democratic leadership in the US House of Representatives, she clearly has a somewhat different view. Here's what she said just in May of this year. She said, quote, "Reparations are not a luxury for our people, but a human right long overdue for millions of Americans. A promise of 40 acres and a meal made to formerly enslaved people over 150 years ago has yet to be filled," unquote. What do you think of that comment?
Well, because first of all, you cannot generalize about any group of people and then arrive at solutions that satisfies all. For instance, the troubling questions that don't get raised is that what about the 3,700 free Blacks who owned slaves, 13,000 slaves? Do their descendants pay? What about the Native Americans, the 5 civilized tribes? They had 3,000 slaves that took on their trail of tears. Now, do the descendants of those Native Americans that owned slaves, do they pay? And what about the whites who came here after slavery ended? What about those that were in the Underground Railroad? So the issue becomes a little more complicated than just all whites are villains and all Blacks are victims.
Right. Now, to many people, money is what matters. A concerned citizen who showed up at the California Reparations Task Force public meeting in early May said the following, quote, "True liberation starts with money," unquote. Now, this past June, when the California Reparations Task Force actually issued their formal recommendations, they recommended up to $1.2 million per year for each qualified Black resident. Now, similarly, last December, when a city-appointed advisory committee on reparations in the city of San Francisco issued their recommendations, they called for up to $5 million paid to each qualified resident. Now, we're not talking about just money here. We're talking about lots and lots of it. Is that what true liberation looks like?
I mean, this is ridiculous. First of all, it's how money is used. Wealth is not created by giving people money. Anytime you separate work from income, it has a harmful effect on the person doing it. Just look at the history of the people who won the lottery. 70% of them end up destroying their lives, 70%. Welfare and the $22 trillion we spent in the poverty program was considered reparations, where 70 cents of every dollar didn't go to the people suffering the problem, but it went to those who served the problem. So just the absence of money, but any group's participation in the economy does not depend on what government gives them. It's their small business formation rate. If you look at a healthy community generates 3 businesses for 1,000 people per year. So if you look at Chinese, Koreans, Nigerians, Caribbean Blacks, they have a higher small business formation rate. So this is where the emphasis, it isn't government giving money, transferring money to people. First of all, the practical is if you give reparations to that amount of people, they better spend some of that on security to protect them from those who didn't get those checks.
Especially
Given
with
the
the
high rate
crime
of
rate being as
black
high as
crime, that's what you're going to be spending some of that money on.
well, excuse me for interrupting. I was saying, especially with the crime rates being as high as they are across the country, security certainly would be advised for people with lots of money. Now, a lot of the reparations proposals, and our colleagues in the next panel will talk more specifically about what's in them, but what we've seen thus far is that these proposals tend to be coupled with a large number of social justice demands. So they're not calling for just money, they're calling for things like affirmative action, police reform, home ownership, prison reform, and so on. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on this quote by economist Dr. Thomas Sowell. And he said, quote, "There are people today who talk justice when they really mean payback, including payback against people who were not even born when historic injustices were committed," unquote. Is that what we are seeing from the social justice demands in the reparations movement?
You know, I really think it's virtue signaling. The officials who seem to be entertaining these proposals, it's a way for them to patronize these protesters because they know that some of these amounts are larger than the state's own budget. So, but it's also, it deflects attention away from the more critical challenges facing us. But people can appear to be a social justice warrior by advocating these abstract recommendations and go on television. They can make a lot of money, just like Black Lives Matter profited from it, $100 million. Now, Abraham Kendi, the high priest of racial justice at Boston University, burned through $50 million in the last 3 years without producing any research. But that's not a scandal. But we ought to be talking about that as well. And the real solutions are found not by looking at the polarization of like whites are villains to be paid and blacks are victims. When you look at life through that kind of prism, it always benefits the ones at the top. In other words, if we have to look at life through a racial prism, when evil wears a black face, it escapes responsibility. There was a 2-hour special on the condition of women in prisons. For 2 hours, we were served up with they were being raped. Every one of the villains was black. Every one of the victims was black. And yet, after that show was over, it didn't generate any discussion about what are we going to do to help these poor women, because you cannot generalize about women. So what are the recommendations when we talk about women? They will be given appointments on boards of directors. That's affirmative action. In other words, you use the conditions of all women as the bait, and the switch occurs when the remedies arrive and the resources, and they go not to those at the bottom, but those at the top in the name of all. And the same will be true with reparations. A lot of the middle class people who are running these organizations, including the caucus, in 2010, they get about $60 million in private donations from corporations. Part of that money in 2010 was
which caucus are you referring to?
The Congressional Black Caucus, of which Barbara Lee is a part.
Right.
I'm really saying that, and they were given money. Part of it was to go to scholarships for low-income Black kids in their district. Well, after an investigative reporter found that the bulk of that money went to the sons and daughters of staff members and grandchildren of caucus members. And they said, oops, and they came back. But they're going to be escape responsibility because race is being used as a shield against holding people responsible. And my position is we must look at the evil that is being done to people. But if we have to if it has to fit a racial narrative, real evil, when it comes wearing a blackface, will escape accountability and responsibility. And that adversely affects low-income people in these communities.
We've got just a couple of minutes left. Let me ask you one last question. Your social activism dates back to the 1960s. You fought for civil rights in the era of Dr. Martin Luther King. Now, this year happens to be the 60th anniversary of his I Have a Dream speech. What do you think Dr. King would think about reparations and the demands for reparations today, or the demands for the kind of social justice agenda we see today?
His last address, Dr. King said, Black America must reach down into the deep, dark regions of its soul and sign and ink its own Emancipation Proclamation. Something that Malcolm X stood for too, that liberation will come when Blacks begin to elevate themselves. And so what a lot of the groups that the Woodson Center supports, like Voices of Black Mothers United and others, these are people who are looking in the past and say, when whites were at their worst, we were at their best. When we built our own railroad, we built our own hotels, our schools, we closed the education gap. In other words, a lot of our advocates today are looking back at the values, not the wealth or the money, but the values that sustained us in slavery and in Jim Crow. And they are applying those same values in some of the most toxic neighborhoods that we support. And so our time and attention should not be on reparations, the assumption that money is the solution, but we should be investing in people that are engaged in self-help and self-restoration in these communities, instead of looking at all problems have to have a bipolar solution. Blacks can only benefit if whites are hurt. We must find non-polarizing solutions to the problem. But the problems facing America is moral and spiritual in crisis, not economic. That's why, according to the Harvard study, the highest level of death for children or young people is homicide in the urban communities, suicide among affluent whites in Silicon Valley, where teens suicide is 6 times the national average, and among Appalachian whites, it is prescription drugs. So we have to come together as a nation and put aside the racial lens to which we look at these problems and address the real problems, and that is a moral and spiritual free fall that is consuming our young people. We can't do that if we have to be sitting here talking about reparations.
Well, on that note, this concludes our Q&A session, but thank you very much for those comments. Josh?
Thank you to Ying and Bob for that excellent discussion. Now I'd like to go to 2 additional experts on this issue. Let me start with Betty Chu, the Vice Chair of Defend American Ideals. Betty, could you talk a little bit about how reparations policies affect communities that are on the wrong side of these policies?
First of all, I would like to thank the sponsors for this very informative and necessary event today. And particularly, I want to thank Bob Woodson for the many years of sharing his wisdom in a manner to help solve some of the problems of the United States, but additionally, to do it in a manner that is for equal rights for all. So with that, I feel that in studying just even superficially with reference to the history of the United States of America, there have been many, many groups that have been discriminated against, that have had to work against adverse societal issues in order to survive in this country and in order to benefit this country. Among them, but not exclusive, are the American Indians, the Hispanics, other Asians, and other ethnic groups such as our settlers, with reference to the Italians and the Irish, not to exclude other groups. I have been active in trying to protect the civil rights of the Chinese Americans here in America. So I want to use that as an example of how this reparations movement is unfair to other groups that may be have been impacted by discrimination and unfair conditions in America. The Chinese Exclusion Act actually was enacted after maybe about 20 or 30 years of the first arrival of the Chinese here in America. And it was enacted after slavery had been, after California became a free state. In the 1850s, the Chinese Exclusion Act was enacted in 1882 and was certainly after Blacks had already been given the right and did exercise their right to vote. The Chinese Exclusion Act in and of itself was the first federal legislation as well as the first California legislation that defined a specific racial group to prohibit them from coming into America, from prohibiting them from education, from rights to vote, from the court system, from educational systems here in the United States, even including a prohibition against the right to be buried here in the United States. And that existed even after World War II with the Immigration Act that limited our immigration of our group to only 105, with only actually 51 permitted to apply for entry into the United States. But let me go back to something more current. In 1961, when I first tried to apply for a loan to purchase a home, I have said that the Chinese did not even have the right, not even the right to have an application blank for home ownership loans. As late as 1961, there have already been multiple financial institutions that provided home ownership loans to other minority groups, which included the Blacks, the Hispanics, and the Japanese. It was only the Chinese, even though we had commercial banks, we did not have any banks that would make home loan applications, since we were part of the group that was denied home ownership for many years here in California. And even if you take it to the current situation, the affirmative action legislation, as well as proposals for constitutional revisions to current time, has been very hard and targeted in targeting the Chinese American and the Chinese population here in California. The critical rights theory, that also has been very major in that regard. But when you talk about the discrimination in the past, slavery, in at least some of the slaves were provided with home ownership and was provided with food and shelter. I am not denying that there were abuses of the slaves, but when the Chinese first came over, we were given slave wages in working on the railroads and the mines, and both of which helped America to profit, just like the slaves helped the economy of the United States. However, we were also, like some of the slaves, were abused. So there, and when we are excluded from the rights as others, just like affirmative action, there are some constitutional problems with the exercise of preferences based upon race. And now, additionally, it's unfair, particularly to the to some of us, because some of our ancestors were not even here, and if they were here, in extremely small numbers during the slave trade era. And now we are being made to pay for the sins or the tragedies that happened during the period when our group was not even in significant numbers here in the United States. And in particular, when we ourselves are still a group where we have to fight for our civil rights, in contrast to many other minority groups, we feel that that has a desperate effect upon our community.
Thank you. Thank you, Betty. I'm going to let Andrew jump in for a minute. We're going to come back to you shortly, but Andrew, let me turn to you quickly. You're an attorney with PLF. Could you get a little bit more concrete about California's proposed reparations policy? What is being proposed exactly? And maybe talk a little bit more about the reparations policies that are being discussed outside of California.
Certainly, and thank you, Joshua, for the question, and thank you for everyone in attendance for partaking in this very important discussion. As far as what is being proposed, in general, it is the direct cash payments that we all have heard about, and as well as numerous government benefits, entitlements, and programs that are based on race and ancestry. So first of all, those who are eligible are those that are, one, descendants of enslaved African Americans in the United States, or descendants of free African American persons living in the US prior to 1900. Now, those are the eligibility requirements. As far as the compensation, there's cumulative compensation being offered. This is the amount of money that you would be provided if you are in the eligible class that compensates for what the Reparations Task Force has identified as 5 categories of harm, of discriminatory harm stemming from slavery and its progeny. So that's health harms, housing discrimination, mass incarceration and over-policing, property takings, and the devaluation of African-American businesses. The amount of cumulative compensation an eligible person receives varies depending on the length of residency in California. So, for example, if the state would provide eligible recipients 13,619, I believe is the number, for each year they lived in California for the health harms, 3,378 for each year they've lived in California for housing discrimination. These are numbers that several economists that the Reparations Task Force consulted with to come up with these figures. Ultimately, a lifelong resident that has lived in California could receive up to $1.2 million of cumulative compensation. There's no evidence that is required to demonstrate that you actually experienced any harm in these 5 categories, so long as you are in the eligible class of persons. Now, this is in addition to a recommendation for a down payment. While the legislature is determining the amount of cumulative compensation eligible recipients get, based again on the length of residency, the legislature will offer a down payment to eligible recipients in amount yet to be determined. The task force has left that to the legislature. In addition to that, in terms of compensation, the task force is recommending a guaranteed income program for descendants of enslaved persons, again, in an amount to be determined by the legislature. That's all in Chapter 27 of the task force report. And I encourage everybody to look at the task force report. It is available online, 1,000 pages or so of proposals and history to dive into and really get an understanding of what's being proposed. As far as the non-monetary benefits and entitlements, there are a number of them, and I'll just touch upon just a few of them. So they're proposing free college tuition for eligible recipients at California public colleges and universities. They're also recommending a fund or scholarship provided by the state legislature to pay for eligible recipients who are pursuing education degrees. In the area of housing, financial aid is being proposed to descendants of enslaved persons in the form of shared appreciation loans for the purchase of a new home, or subsidized down payments or subsidized mortgage payments. In the grant area, there's a offer of government procurement processes that would specifically support African-American farmers. So basically programs that would favor farmers who are African-American, interest-free loans to small business owners in African-American commercial areas. And then state agencies would also fund and prioritize using African-American owned banks and credit unions. All of this would be implemented through the creation of a new state agency, the California American Freedmen Affairs Agency. It would be an agency that would advance these recommendations. It would also receive funding, so it could support and finance African-American businesses, art, and media. There's actually a proposal in the state Senate, SB 490, that would create this Freedmen Affairs Agency. I think it's still stuck in committee. It hasn't passed both houses yet in the state legislature. So given that all of these programs are race-based, the question is how can the government enact these in light of what California has, which is Proposition 209. That's our constitutional amendment in our state constitution that prevents the state from discriminating against or granting preferential treatment to any individual or group based on race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin. Well, one of the proposals is to overturn Proposition 209. So,
Andrew, let me stop you there so we can get back to Betty and have enough time for Q&A. And I do think upcoming we're going to ask you a little bit more on the legal ramifications of some of these proposals. But turning to Betty, if not reparations, then what should policy makers be looking to adopt instead of reparations to help marginalized communities?
To help marginalized communities, I think there are three basic areas: business, education, and health. And there are solutions to that I think can not only help the marginalized communities of the minorities, but also the marginalized community of the white community. Should not be based upon race. For instance, in education, school choice would be a great start in terms of providing the kind of education that is geared to the individual students to enable them to have a successful and actually an opportunity to become successful in their careers ahead. Health, there needs to be comprehensive studies done. And I think that some of those studies, because health sometimes is related to certain ethnic or cultures or certain genes that may come from a background that may be tied up to the genes that are racial in nature. And in that respect, we need to have the research be able to be conducted for the major health problems of some of these groups. In terms of business, it is no surprise that small business is the answer to be able to increase the economic levels of marginalized communities. And classes and freeing up of any kinds of opportunities for small business advancements in terms of education, as well as risk investment in it, can be achieved through some governmental programs with private business. But all of it really starts with education. And with that, I think then the health issues and business issues that seem to, at least on its surface, if not otherwise, also appear to be discriminatory in nature, can be remedied. It needs to start with education, particularly in the levels of K through 12, and it should start with education as a free choice.
Thank you. Thank you for those ideas, Betty. And before we open up to questions, let me give Andrew one more chance to jump in here. Andrew, you're a lawyer, you deal with the Constitution. If a entity like California were to adopt a reparations policy, is litigation likely? What would that look like?
I think litigation would be likely. You know, a lot of the programs that I mentioned that are being proposed, as I said, those are just really the tip of the iceberg. Those are just some of the many programs they're offering. There's actually some proposals that they're proposing that are subjectively good policy. There's licensing reform, getting rid of the California Environmental Quality Act, which has prohibited a lot of housing being built in California. The problem, though, is going back to litigation, is they are race-based proposals. These are proposals that distribute advantage and disadvantage individuals based on race. Now, presuming they don't overturn Prop 209 when it comes to the proposals that benefit individuals in terms of public education and public employment, you'd have a challenge under Proposition 209. There is, I have to note, another attempt to overturn Proposition 209 currently, the Assembly Constitutional Amendment 7, which I think has yet to be passed, but it seeks to provide an exception to Proposition 209. And then, of course, over the summer, we had the Supreme Court reaffirm the colorblind Constitution in Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard. As the Supreme Court reminded us, eliminating discrimination means eliminating all of it. When you have a program based on race and ancestry, it is subjected to strict scrutiny, which, according to the Supreme Court, is a daunting review. It is a daunting test, because use of race under the 14th Amendment is rare for a reason. Racial classifications are invidious in all contexts. So distinctions between citizens solely because of their ancestry are, by their very nature, odious to a free people whose institutions are founded upon the doctrine of equality. That's in Rice versus Cayetano. So what that would look like as far as litigation is you'd have the court applying strict scrutiny and determining whether any of these programs can withstand this daunting examination. They would look to whether any of these programs are meant to remedy specific identified instances of past discrimination. So any measure that is put forward with the basis that it's meant to ameliorate, to remedy disproportionate impact or close the wealth gap, that wouldn't be an instance where the reason is to address specific identified instances of past discrimination, or if the reason was to promote equity, for instance. The court won't give deference to the state as far as its interests or its purported interest in providing these reparations proposals. And the Supreme Court also reminded us that there has to be a logical endpoint to these programs. So they would look to whether, are there any limits? Do they last in perpetuity, these programs? As they're currently proposed here in California, there doesn't seem to be a limit to these programs. So, you know, all of that is to say that ultimately litigation would not be with the purpose of having a program where you simply expand racial classifications, where everybody, depending on their race, will get some form of reparations based on whatever immutable characteristics are put forward. The point would be to stop government from discriminating and preventing people from competing for opportunity on unequal footing, opening opportunity to all, regardless of race. As Supreme Court Justice Thomas said, a world in which everyone is defined by their skin color, demanding ever increasing entitlements and preferences on that basis is not what the Constitution allows. Not only is that exactly the kind of factionalism that the Constitution was meant to safeguard against, it is a factionalism based on ever-shifting sands. So again, the goal would be not to have a patchwork of an expanded classification of races being advantaged based on immutable characteristics. It is to allow everyone, regardless of their race, to compete for opportunity, regardless of their skin color.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you to both you and Betty for that. It's great insights. I want to, we have a lot of questions in the Q&A, and I want to give us an opportunity to go through as many of them as we can in our remaining 20 minutes. Let me start with Bob. The first question here concerns the economic disparities between marginalized communities. If not reparations as a solution to addressing those economic disparities that I think exist, what should we do? And wouldn't reparations actually solve that problem?
Well, first of all, if you look at Thomas Sowell's study, he said that Black Americans made progress every decade after slavery. We were closing the wealth gap. We were closing the income gap. The education gap was going up until the 60s when it all halted. It all stopped. And so as David Birch argues in his looking at entrepreneurship, the key to participation is the small business formation rates. If race were the culprit, then why is it that Nigerians and Black Caribbeans outperform whites and Asians when it comes to education, family formation, wealth accumulation? If race were the culprit, then why aren't these groups suffering equally as other groups have? That's the question. But again, we must look in the past. Blacks closed the education gap between 1920 and 1940 in the South from 3 years to 6 months in just 20 years because of the creation of 5,000 Rosenwald Booker T schools. The question is, if we were able to close the education gap when we had used textbooks, half the budgets of white schools, why can't we apply that same principle today? And many groups in the urban centers are doing precisely that looking at the values and virtues that were in, and attitudes and actions that we engaged in under segregation, and they have brought them forward today and successfully applying them in urban centers with some amazing results.
Well said, Bob. I want to go to another question in the Q&A. I'm going to ask Andrew to take this one. Andrew, this is about reparations as they applied to descendants or Japanese interned individuals after World War II. Isn't that precedent for reparations today?
No.
I don't think it would be, and I understand the temptation to draw the comparison. When you look at who qualified for reparations after World War II, it wasn't simply based on Japanese ancestry. It was based on those who were interned, evacuated, deported because of the policies of the federal government in World War II. Compare that to the California reparations eligibility. It is for individuals who are simply descendants of enslaved persons or descendants of free persons living in the United States prior to 1900. There's no qualifier for showing harm or being a victim of harm. And there was actually challenges to the reparations programs under the Japanese reparations programs under the Civil Liberties Act. There were Japanese residents who were interned, but they were not permanent resident aliens or US citizens. And the reparations, the compensation was only for Japanese Americans who were permanent resident aliens or citizens. These individuals, I think, were from Peru. They were Japanese individuals from Peru that were interned. They were denied the compensation under the Civil Liberties Act. There were German internees that fought for a right to compensation under the Civil Liberties Act because Congress had found that the laws were motivated by specific discriminatory intent against Japanese individuals based on racial discrimination, stereotypes against Japanese citizens during that time, that the Civil Liberties Act was merely intended for those of Japanese ancestry who were subject to that harmful conduct. So there were challenges to it. And I think if you look at the legal distinctions, you can't draw a close comparison to what's currently being proposed for African-American reparations.
Thank you, Andrew. Let me turn to Betty. Betty, there's a number of questions in the chat that concern different groups that have been treated ill in the history of America. You talked a lot about the Chinese Exclusion Act, and I mean, there are millions of examples, especially in California. Chinese couldn't own property in California, I think, until the 1920s. But that's not the end of the list. There are, I think, Ukrainians was mentioned in there, or obviously Jewish Americans, and the litany of gripes that individuals of discriminated against peoples is long in America. How are we supposed to deal with that reality?
That is the whole problem with the reparations movement, is that it is very difficult to be able to distinguish the percentage of harm as to each individual racial group, and even among the people within the racial groups themselves, not only within a certain identified period, but throughout different periods of time. So I do not believe that there is a simple solution to being able to identify that. The only distinction, I suppose, with reference to, or similarity with reference to the Black slavery movement, is the Chinese the way the Chinese were treated during the gold rush and the railroad construction period of time, where we were subjected to different housing arrangements because of the we couldn't own property and we could not live in certain parts of town, in addition to the salaries that we were receiving was so far below that of the average majority that it could be considered slave conditions in the way that the Chinese were treated. The Japanese similarly, during the time of the war, but that was taking of property rather than treating them as slaves. And that also distinguishes perhaps the Chinese, but also the American Indians. Some of the American Indians were treated like slaves. But if you want the similarity as it relates to reparations for the slave group, then you have to start with the employment conditions or the work conditions that were similar to that. But other than that, every group, I believe, that has helped America by immigrating to America has suffered discrimination in one form or another, and it is very difficult to weigh the differences in quality and in terms of depth.
Thank you. Thank you, Betty. I want to turn back over to Bob. There's a question in here that is, I think, in your wheelhouse, and it deals with President Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty. And I guess the question is, What does that say about the prospect of reparations today?
That's a great question, because our whole point in our book, Red, White, and Black, Rescuing American History from Revisionists and Race Hustlers, we make the point that after one of our scholars looked at the state of marriage on 6 major plantations, and they found that 75% of slave households had a man and a woman raising children. The nuclear family continued to prosper for 100 years after slavery up until 1960. Poverty was dramatically reduced from 82% at the end of the Second World War down to about 30% in the 60s. But all of Black America between 1930s during the Depression, we had the highest marriage rate of any other group. I was born during that period. Elderly people could walk safely in their community without fear of being assaulted by their children. Children were not shot in their cribs. When I was a teenager, I never heard a gun explode. So a lot of the conditions that we face changed in the 60s when precisely the poverty programs, $22 trillion where 70 cents of the dollars went to those who serve the poor, not the poor. They asked which problems are fundable, not which ones are solvable. When you separate work from income, what the social scientists who were promoting socialism predicted came true. They said, if you separate work from income and make welfare an entitlement and reparations, it'll result in children dropping out of school, out of wedlock births. And so you saw Black families intact up until the 60s, and see that number decline to now today, 70% of children are born in single parent households. So that is a direct result of programs of the 60s. What racism and what Jim Crow could not destroy, the poverty programs of the 60s decimated the Black community and it gave us what we have today.
Thank you, Bob. I want to turn to Ying. Ying, maybe you could build on that and talk a little bit about the cultural results of some of how the cultures of different communities play into the results here. I'm thinking, in particular, I represent some very poor Chinese Americans in New York City. I think it's the poorest demographic in the city, and yet those individuals are being discriminated against by particular education policies that are preventing them from going to school. So do you have anything to say about the cultural differences in these marginalized communities and the impacts it's having and how it relates to reparations policy?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm grateful to PLF for representing those Chinese immigrants. I do think that one of the most awful things we've seen in our modern age is that the people who are marginalized, who are poor, like the plaintiffs you represent, they are the ones being discriminated against by the virtue signalers and the race hustlers. I do want to say that obviously different cultures or different ethnicities have different cultures, different races have different histories. Black Americans are the only ones with the history of slavery here in the United States. They're the only ones who have faced a whole variety of policies that others have not. And so I think what Bob said earlier, I would harken back to him pointing out that they're different, that the Black community itself, despite the history, it's not monolithic, that there are Black immigrant groups that have showed different kinds of results. And for the same, and by a similar token, the Asian community is not monolithic either. You will find very different statistics about income, about graduation rates, about livelihoods and areas where people live amongst different Asian groups. So Southeast Asians tend to have very different statistics compared to East Asians, and then amongst the East Asian groups, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, so on. So I think different groups are different. There are cultural differences. We cannot discount that. The one thing I always caution people both on my side of the issues as well as on the opposite side, is that we need to be very careful about overgeneralizing about different races. That a lot of times it seems like some of the issues we've talked about especially in recent years, whether it's the affirmative action issue or the reparations issue, it sounds like we're pitting Black people against Asians, and we need to be very careful about avoiding those general stereotypes. We need to be very careful about vilifying members of the Black community. And what's more dangerous, I think, sometimes is sort of a soft form of vilification, that somebody says, oh, Asian people are more hardworking and hence the Asian community doesn't face XYZ problem, and inevitably the implication there is that somehow the Black community is inherently flawed in other ways. So I think we need to absolutely get away from those kinds of comments, those kinds of stereotypes. If anybody sits around telling you, oh, I love Asian people because they're so hardworking, stop them. And Asian people who say those kinds of things need to stop saying those things too. It is wrong to discriminate against any racial group. A friend of mine recently said to me, if Nigerians were being discriminated against, this is a friend of mine who's Chinese, she would fight for them too. And I hope that is the case for everybody. I think the affirmative action issue has benefited tremendously from the activism and the eloquent rhetoric of people like Bob, Black conservatives across the country. And so I do hope that cultural differences are things we cannot deny, and we shouldn't deny them, but I think we need to make sure that we don't accidentally, unintentionally, and on a sustained level vilify one group versus another. I think we need to all work together to fight against race-based policies that are not good for the most marginalized groups of every race.
Josh, can I just offer a quick footnote to what May's saying? That some of our studies said that the Vietnamese who came as boat people prospered better than those that were sponsored by families.
Joshua, if I may.
It's a study because they were compelled to kind of bootstrap it, as opposed to those who were sponsored. Just a very small point, but it makes your point.
Thank you, Bob.
You
Yes,
can't
Betty.
generalize about people.
Betty, you have 1 minute.
Yes, with reference, that's why our community has fought so hard to have equal rights with reference to education. That has now been a way out for some of the impoverished Chinese families.
Thank you, Betty. I wanted to, in my prerogative as moderator, I wanted to echo one of Ying's comments there about one of the things that I was most I really enjoyed about the Supreme Court's opinion, the Chief Justice's opinion in Students for Fair Admission this past July, was the idea that these gross racial stereotypes need to be done away with. The idea that all Asians should be treated as a monolith, or all African Americans or all Hispanics, that someone from Argentina should be treated the same as somebody from Mexico, or someone from Vietnam should be treated the same as someone from Japan. But even within those groups, it's still ridiculous. It's absurd to think that all Vietnamese people think or act alike, or all Argentinian people think or act alike. The Constitution requires individuals to be treated as individuals. That's what the Equal Protection Clause means. Andrew, in 30 seconds, tell us when these reparations policies are expected to be enacted, or if there is a timeline for them.
Most likely, we are going to see proposals being offered in the legislature in January. But as the task force members have indicated, it's going to take more than one legislative session. So you're going to see a long-term effort at all of this. And I just want to add, one of the concerns I've heard throughout studying this issue is that, questioning reparations is to deny the profound tragedy of slavery and its effects. But opposing discrimination by government is absolutely an acknowledgement of slavery and its sordid history afterwards, because skepticism of government discrimination stems from an acknowledgement that government discrimination in the past, including upholding slavery was wrong. So we acknowledge slavery and its impact above all by not repeating the mistakes that led to it, which is allowing government to treat us differently based on race. And hopefully the legislature will not continue that.
Well, thank you for that, Andrew. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. If we did not get to your question, or if you have a question you think once we conclude, please do not hesitate to email us at events@pacificlegal.org. Please join me in thanking Ying Ma, who moderated with me today, and our esteemed panelists for their insightful remarks, Betty Chu, Andrew Quinio, and of course, Bob Woodson. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.